So, welcome everyone to Optimum States of Consciousness for Creatives. And today we're going to be talking about a few different things. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer. I'm going to leave questions as well. So, there'll be some time, maybe in the middle and at the end, to answer questions if you have them. So, if everyone's with me right now, I'd like to take a moment and just kind of draw us all into a similar state of consciousness if we can. So, if you can, find a comfortable place to sit, or if you're standing, feel comfortable that you can stand there for the next few minutes. And we're just going to kind of take a moment to come into ourselves and get really present with where we are and what we're about to do. So if you can, close your eyes. Hopefully you're not driving. So if you're driving, please don't do any of these things. Close your eyes. Bring yourself into your body. If you're sitting, feel yourself on the chair, the ground, the sofa, whatever it may be. Feel your body contacting that object. And now bring yourself to this moment. Everything that you were doing previously, all the rushing maybe to get here, figuring out how to use the platform, any of those things, not being able to use your microphone or your video, just take that and leave that and just drop it and let it go. You can visualize this physically of just handing off items. You can just feel the sense of letting go. And typically what our brains like to do is it wants to move to the next thing. So as you're letting it go, just pause in that moment. Pause in that place where you've released everything. You're here now. We don't need to know how it's going to go. We don't need to anticipate what comes next. We can just be here. You can tune into the sound of my voice as a point of focus. You can tune into your breath, the sensation in your body. Maybe you're wondering why all of a sudden you find yourself in a meditation or a mindful moment. And just be in that and see how long you can suspend that moment of being in between one idea, action, and before the next one starts. And then take a big breath in. Pause at the top. And then exhale. And do that again. Big breath in. Pause at the top. And exhale. And now you can open your eyes, keep them closed if you want, however you feel most engaged. And today we're going to talk about different states of consciousness and how those can be applied to a creative life. And so a few questions we're going to hopefully answer along the way are, what does it mean to be a creative? How do we hone our mind and bring in optimum states of consciousness? And can we really willfully enter different states of consciousness? So we'll start with just a brief definition of consciousness. Now, for most of us, that might just mean I'm either awake or I'm asleep, and sometimes I'm dreaming. And then there's the unconscious state, which is, sometimes happens after different things, medical things generally, or you have too much fun and you find yourself unconscious. But there are actually many other states of consciousness. Some are in between being awake and dreaming. Some are an other aspects of being awake that we don't normally hear about. Flow is one of them. There's trance, there's meditative, there's people who channel, the astral project. There's actually lots and lots of different states of consciousness that can be of great benefit for what we're trying to do in our life. There's not just the standard waking state where we are hopefully all right now. We're in a place of listening, our brain is active, and that's considered the normal state of consciousness. But there are several others, and people throughout all of history that we know of have been changing their state of consciousness. Now, a lot of times we hear this from the perspective of altering consciousness. And while that term is accurate in a way, it makes it seem as if the standard waking state of consciousness is the baseline and the normal, and everything else is some like aberration of that. And I personally don't, believe in that kind of framework. I think there are different states of consciousness, different states of being that apply to all different kinds of things that we want to do. And so while you may have experienced having a state change before and you may not have, I'm going to introduce a few things that will probably open up the idea that you have experienced different states of consciousness. You have probably also experienced the state that you're maybe hearing more about that they're calling flow right now. And so, this is a conference for writers, editors, and publishers. And so there's some level of creativity involved in that. And so if you're a writer and you've ever found yourself handwriting or on the computer and all of a sudden you just are immersed in what you're doing, time disappears, you forgot you needed to pee or you didn't drink water, and you're just in this place where it's just you and the activity you're doing. That's considered a state of flow. We can get there with conversations. Sometimes you're in a conversation with someone and you're going and time flies by. You can be listening to music and have the same thing occur. You can be playing an instrument. Action sports are really good for this because there's that kind of risk aspect. So you need to be focused. And that's what key aspect of the state of flow is focus. And so while for most of us, including myself, before I understood what this state of consciousness was, this was happenstance. It would happen. I would find myself in it. It was really fun. It was amazing. I felt the best I've ever felt. And that's actually one of the ways we define flow is you feel your best and perform your best. And so for most of my life, I was kind of chasing these activities that seemed to bring me to that place. Now, I couldn't necessarily curate that. I couldn't say I'm going to do this and step into this state of consciousness at that time. But what I later learned is that is actually a possibility. We can create an environment where we can step into these different states of consciousness willfully. Now, it's not a guarantee. It's not to say that if you do all these things that you're guaranteed to step into a different state of consciousness. But what we can say is that there's techniques and protocols that will more than likely facilitate that for you. And so one of the keys for any kind of state change, especially a willful state change, is focus. It's just directing our attention where we want it to go. And this is challenging in today's day and age in this world, and especially for people joining this conference that are dealing with neurodivergence of different types. But there are things that we can also do that can help direct our focus. And so while it is very difficult today to stay focused, and there are numerous things out there that are pulling us in all directions, one of the biggest ones is one of the things that we're using right now, our computer and potentially our phone. And when we're attempting to get into a creative place, the last thing we want is to be distracted. We don't need ringers and notifications and flashing lights and all of these things pulling us in different directions, especially when they're usually leading to a communication or a social media message or things like that. And I'm sure you guys have heard these things before. And it just bears repeating that if we're trying to bring ourselves to a place where creativity is an aspect of how we create our life, how we, bring in the abundance and the income, then being able to direct ourselves willfully is a benefit that we can curate as we're going forward. And now some of the other things that can be distractions are also our internal state. Depending on if we've created a comfortable environment for ourselves. If we're uncomfortable, our body is going to be kind of consistently giving us little messages that we need to move or adjust or do those things. So that is actually one of the key elements of setting yourself up for the active part of creativity is creating a comfortable space, having yourself set up where you don't have to get up in 5 minutes and go grab your water bottle or do those different things. And so as we're moving further into this conversation around consciousness and the different states that we can employ and bring forward, the question will naturally arise of like, what states are best when? What is going to be the optimal state of consciousness when I want to be creative? And so for that, let's first start with what is creativity? What is the process of creating? And how can we break that down to kind of see how the different states could apply to it? And so for most of us, I think the idea of creativity is more so around the idea, having a brilliant idea, having that character and that plot line for your novel, having the inspiration to create a new product or an idea or whatever that is. We generally link creativity with that one piece of the inspiration aspect of it. And while that's a huge part of creativity, for sure, there are other aspects around creativity that take something from an idea, which we can have many of every day, and then taking it to the next step of how do we take that idea and actually bring it out into the world? How do we go from having that brilliant bestseller idea to having the brilliant bestseller novel? And what are the pieces in between? So one of the key aspects I've seen in my own creative process and when working with other creatives is having a strategy to bring those things into the world. So once you have the idea, you need to be able to create the process or protocol, the strategy to get it out of your head and into the world. And so for writers, that can mean, how do I get in front of the computer and start typing, and how do I keep that space in myself that feels creative and is moving in that direction and getting the words out. And so strategy is a key element for any creative. Being able to understand that there are also different times of the day that you're going to feel more creative. You're going to have different states of what they call like cognitive energy. And so creativity is actually linked with divergent cognitive thinking. And so the idea with divergence in this aspect is that your brain is allowing ideas, data, thoughts to weave and interact in ways that it normally doesn't. And this is because we have an area of the brain called the default mode network that generally likes to rationalize and kind of order and organize things and says, this belongs over here, this belongs over there. But when we're in a divergent thinking process, we no longer have the default mode network turned up. It can be turned down. And just as a caveat to some of this stuff, neuroscience, neurobiology, and all that. It's a beautiful science. It's really doing some amazing things, and it's just really scratching the surface. So when I say things like the default mode network is active, it doesn't mean other aspects of your brain aren't active. It just means that seems to be, from our current understanding, the most active part right now. The brain is an absolutely fascinating aspect of actually the universe, but specifically human beings, in how complex it works. And so when I say that certain areas or neurochemicals or things like that are present or active, it just means they seem to be in more of a dominating place versus the other things. And so as we're looking to be creative and optimize our state for that, we want to be able to tune into the natural energy that's within us in that time. So for me, one of a really creative time for me tends to be the morning when I first wake up, because I'm coming out of a state of consciousness that's usually, we tend to dream towards the end of the night. Once we've done our deep sleep, we start getting into the REM cycles. And then as we're coming out of sleep, there's actually a state of consciousness called hypnagogia. And that happens before you go to sleep and as you're waking up from sleep. And this was actually a state of consciousness that's been linked to many, many, many creative endeavors. Thomas Edison used to purposefully bring himself to this place. He would hold on to something in his hand, fall asleep while sitting in a chair. And as he fell asleep, the object would drop out of his hand, hit the ground, and it would wake him up in hypnagogia. And he would have an insight into that next thing he wanted to create, that answer to that question he was looking to have. And so as you're waking up from sleep, it's a good time to not grab your phone and not necessarily engage in any what we would call more cognitive process. So not starting to do tasks and things like that. If you can, have a journal next to your bed. If an idea comes to you, jot it down real quick, things like that. So for you as well, there may be different times that are more creative. Another time that I found was actually like in the afternoon, post lunch, kind of in that like slightly sleepy state. We can find ourselves having the default mode network turned down, and all of a sudden there's just this possibilities become more present inside of ourselves. And so as we're moving from creativity into strategy, looking at, okay, so I feel more creative first thing in the morning. So maybe that's a good idea to jot down some notes about, that new character in your story, or, if you're editing somebody else's work, oh, okay, I feel like I have the right way to say it here. And so take some notes in that early part of the morning, if that's your time. If it's more in the afternoon, when you're feeling a little bit like your energy has gone down, just set yourself up throughout your day to be able to maximize those energies as they're present. And now the last piece of creativity is effort and action. And so again, that's more of a convergent, or maybe I haven't mentioned that yet. That's more of a convergent thinking thing. Like we have to take the idea, we have to sit in front of the computer, and we have to start typing. We need to get things done. And sometimes this doesn't feel as exciting. It doesn't feel as creative. It doesn't feel as natural to do those things. But this is a big part of the creative process. Being a creative professionally means that there has to be effort and action in order to get those ideas out of your head. And setting yourself up for that ahead of time by creating, the way that I tended to do it before was creating blocks of time in my day, and not super strict. I don't want to get into this like really strictly calendaring yourself unless that really works for you personally. But it's really about tuning in with yourself and starting to get present with, what does work for me. And in order to do that, we have to have presence to see what is and isn't working, and having that objective framework to not jump into judgment if something isn't working. It's just something that can be altered and changed. And we can curate our life, our working sessions, our creative sessions to bring ourselves to those places where we're more likely to get into those states that we want to get into. And so let's say you've gotten yourself into the place, you're working, you're in front of the computer, you're typing away, and you find yourself in a flow state. And for a lot of people, because this is something that just sort of happens, we tend to want to hold on to it. And we want to stay in that place as long as possible. And while this may seem counterintuitive, that is not the best strategy for being able to consistently access this state of consciousness. Because when you get into a state like flow, it's very neurochemically and energy demanding. It's a beautiful state. Like I said, you feel your best and you perform your best. That's amazing. And on the backside of that, you've used a lot of your body and brain's energy. And so if you hold on to that state and you stay in it for, let's say, hours, on the other side of that, you're probably going to feel pretty drained. And then getting into that state again tomorrow and the next day, which is something as a professional creative, you need to be able to enter that place of creativity, that place of being your most efficient, most productive, but also your most inspired self, day after day. You don't have the luxury of, every once in a while I have a great idea and I write a cool poem. Like if you're a professional creative, you need to be able to do this on the regular. And so knowing how to get yourself out and what the timeframes are that are appropriate for you is a really key aspect, and that comes into recovery. And so what we can do now is we can look at flow in particular as a state of consciousness, and we'll talk about flow as a cycle, because it is. There's 4 aspects that have been studied, kind of observed in many, many, many people, hundreds, thousands of people. And so when we're first trying to enter into that state of consciousness that's going to really bring us to the highest level of creativity, the first part is called struggle. And basically what this means is there's some level of friction in your person. You want to do this thing. And again, this is why action sports, most of the initial research, other than just kind of like the questioning people, was done around action sports because it was such a reliable way to get into flow. It was because they had this risk, and this struggle phase had to be so fast. Because if you're skiing or snowboarding or doing something like mountain biking, something where there's speed and risk involved, you got to move through that really quickly. You don't have a lot of time to be like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do next. You just got to make decisions. And that's one of the key aspects of the flow state is we move into subconscious and unconscious processing. And we are ridiculously fast in that state. Our brain can process so much more information in the subconscious and unconscious way. There's wildly different numbers, but one that was really interesting was at the unconscious level, we process 27,000 times more information per second. So 27,000 times more. And I think they were using the idea of how much visual data we take in. And so as you're entering into wanting to get into that state of flow, you're first going to meet struggle. Now, for writers, I'm sure you guys have experienced this before. You're get writing, it's going pretty well, and then all of a sudden you're just kind of stopped. You're stuck. Like the next chapter doesn't come, the idea doesn't come forward. Even in the editing process, you were in a good place. You were really able to kind of move the narrative where you wanted it to, and then all of a sudden you're just like, I don't got anything. And so from the struggle phase, which is kind of more like the neurochemicals are like cortisol and norepinephrine, we need to move into the release phase. And the chemical that gets released here is nitric oxide. And what that does is actually flushes the body of those stress chemicals. And so there are activities we can do that can move us into release. Things like getting up from your computer if you're in a writing block and going for a walk in nature are really powerful. Um, Light exercise is really good as a release. You don't want it to be too heavy. You don't want it to be an exertion, but enough to occupy your brain so that it can start to go in different directions. Because again, that creative process happens when we're able to focus, but we're also able to let ourselves have a little bit of a free form. And so another really good release actually is taking a shower, getting under the warm water, washing yourself. We tend to have a lot of like open thoughts can come when we're in the shower. And so if you ever find yourself really stuck, a hot shower can be a really helpful thing. And there are several other ones. But then after we move out of release, we go into flow. Now, this is the coveted state. People want to get to this place where, like I said, you're writing that novel or book that just, it hits, it lands. It's that time when you're in that conversation and you're just the best version of yourself. The information is just coming to you. It feels effortless. And that's another aspect of this state is it's effortless. I don't have to try. It's just happening. And this is the different chemicals here can be like dopamine, endorphins, and anandamide. And the fact that you have so many of these chemicals showing up is why flow is so taxing. It's the synthesization of all of your processes happening at once. This is presence in motion. This is why flow is such a coveted state as well, is because, a lot of times we can maybe get into presence when we sit still and close our eyes, or, if we're doing one thing. But how do we stay present in an active way? How do you go to work and be present? How do you engage with someone in a conversation and be present? How do you do these different things that you need to do and be able to be self-aware so that you can, bring yourself to these places? And flow is one of those ways. There's other ways you can do it. There's deep listening practices where you really fully lock in with the person. You hold eye contact and you listen from a place of everything they're saying is the most important thing I could be hearing right now. And this is just something we can create in ourselves. And sometimes it has to happen consciously at first. But after we move out of flow, after we're in that state, we need recovery because there's been a lot of activity internally and we need to be able to recover. And I actually call this the preparation phase as well, because one of the surest ways to not be able to enter into these optimum states of consciousness is to feel exhausted, burnt out, and overwhelmed. So if you're feeling those things, the likelihood that you're going to be able to enter one of these places it's very low. It's not impossible. It can definitely happen, but it's not very likely. And so recovery is also preparation. What can we do to bring ourselves to that place? And mindfulness is definitely one of them. I look at mindfulness as just being, my mind is fully where I want it to be. I am able to be where I want to be. And all those practices, meditation, tuning into your breath, being present with nature, really what that's looking to do is to curate this place in ourselves where we have willful control and a say in where our brain goes. And that plays huge into creativity, and especially as a professional creative. We need to be able to direct ourselves where we want to go. And so as we're moving through these, so some recovery practices, you can go for a light walk. Exercise is great. A massage, a sauna, a hot tub, even an ice bath, if you're into that kind of thing. Breathing exercises, listening to music. Now, some things that are not good recovery is screens. Stay away from social media, stay away from Netflix. While it may seem like you're relaxed in that moment, your brain is actually very active. It's processing a lot of visual information. You're actually at one level kind of experiencing what you're watching too. This is why when we watch like action adventure movies, we like tend to feel like, holy crap, like that's happening. And scary movies as well, or scary shows, like we're kind of living that experience. And so I'm not here to say that you need to stop using all social media and give away your screen and things like that. That's unreasonable. But just knowing when to place those things in and doing it in a time that makes the most sense for you as you're coming out of a creative process. And so you can actually cycle this creative process multiple times in a day. And it's actually the best way to be able to enter these states is not to be so absorbed that you lose yourself for half of the day. While that may seem really great and you got, like, say, maybe a good chunk of what you wanted to do that day done, or even several days worth of work done because you just stayed in there for like 3 or 4 hours, again, you're probably going to be very drained on the other side of it. And it could be several days or weeks before you end up back there. And what we want to be able to do is repeat this over and over again. Maybe it's only once or twice a day. It's fine. Maybe it's only once a day. Maybe it's only a couple times a week. Just work with yourself on this to see, what is the best state, how often, how long. As a general rule, our brains have the kind of natural capacity to be fully present for really only about 30 to 45 minutes, intense presence like flow. And then we need a break. We need a shift. We need a transition. We need to do something else to give ourselves a little bit of a mini recovery. And we want to use active recovery if we can. Again, that's where that going out into nature, taking a quick hike, light exercise, a shower can also be a recovery thing. Any of these things where you're not jumping into more cognitive work. Going from a deep writing session to answering messages is not necessarily the best transition. It's something different, but it's also cognitively demanding. So you're just like tapping more of those resources that you needed. And so, because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, I'm going to just talk about distraction elimination. So one of the keys here, I talked about it briefly earlier, to getting into a good space for creativity is distraction elimination. So this means all notifications are turned off. The phone is on silent and even put away. Actually, they did some research, and I don't remember, I can't quote it exactly, but the presence of any cell phone will distract you, not even your own. Just seeing a phone in your space will take your mind in that direction. And so don't have the phone visible, turn off the notifications, clear off your desktop, the 35 to 40 tabs open on the internet browser. That's a really big thing that can just, again, like you just look up and you're like, oh, that thing I was working on earlier. I'll jump there for a few minutes. Oh, that thing. Oh, that thing. Oh, that thing. And this kind of leads into the idea of the difference between what we think we have this ability to multitask. What the current science shows is that what we're doing is just really fast task switching. So we're going one task to the other task, one task to the other task. The downside is our brain stays on that previous task for up to 5 minutes, sometimes even 15 after we've switched. So even though we're doing something different, our brain is still kind of like figuring out that other thing we were doing. So if you do this multiple times, you can imagine your brain's going to be spread all over the place. It's going to be thinking about 4 different things while you're trying to do one thing. And this is why I can sometimes feel like, I don't know, I can't focus right now. And so, distraction elimination is a real key. And especially for, working with something like neurodivergence, ADHD, things like that. Like, the ruminating part of the brain is going to come in and start saying, well, you should be doing this and you should be doing that and you should have done that better and this and that. And what we want to do is create a space where there's less things that are going to grab us and take us into different directions that we don't really want to go. That may happen. Our brain is probably going to chime in and say some things, but if we can create our space in a way where that's greatly reduced, that's going to be all the more productive for you as you're moving forward. The last thing I want to mention here before we jump into questions is just there's things called flow triggers. And a few of these are complete concentration. Like I said, flow follows focus. Novelty. So this is why we get really inspired when we go to new places. It's because we start seeing these new things. Our brain starts linking the patterns. That's part of the creative process, is pattern recognition. So when our brain starts linking new patterns, one thing you can do also is crossword puzzles if they are interesting to you, or Sudoku, things like that. Because the more patterns you link, the more dopamine gets released, and then your pattern recognition system becomes more active. This is why sometimes when you're doing a crossword, you get like a streak of words in a row. It's because that system is activated. A couple others are deep embodiment. This is, again, why physical activities can be really good for this. But then also clear goals. And this just feeds off, again, the dopamine system. When you have a clear goal, I'm going to write X amount of words today, and you accomplish that goal, you get a little hit of dopamine. And that helps you stay motivated, focused, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. You can feel free to unmute yourself. You can type them in the chat. If there's anything that I've shared that you feel like you want me to expand upon, now would be the time. Give us an example of what a day working through these cycles might look like. Yeah. So again, depending on when you feel you're the most creative, for me, my pattern was waking up in the morning, doing a light bit of mindfulness or like a yoga practice, moving into either working or having a light bite to eat, and then setting up the times. Again, like, I don't want to structure this too much. You don't want to say, I'm going to do this for 45 minutes and then I'm going to break, but you also don't want to get lost for 3 hours. So 45-minute work blocks are about the best. And then cycling in 10-minute breaks until, like, say, the midday break, where you really want a longer break. If you are actually entering these states, they're taxing. So what may end up happening is, when I put this into action in my life fully, I was getting into flow and really getting in there like twice a day for like 2 hours each. And I could sustain that for about 3 weeks. And then all of a sudden I just found myself physically drained. And so longer breaks are going to be helpful. 45 minutes to roughly an hour and a half, probably maximum, as a working block to give yourself those transitions. A good break in the middle, hydrate well. These states are also very demanding when it comes to nutrients. So eating well, hydrating well, having a good amount of activity in your day, and then creating the space for yourself to wander. Let your mind wander. And don't do that, through social media, but go for a walk with a friend and just have kind of a casual conversation. Maybe if you're kind of trying to come up with an idea for your book or something like that, that can be a great way to ideate, to brainstorm these ideas. Just go for a little walk, do this. If moving the body occupies a little bit of the consciousness. It's when we walk, we don't think about walking. It's the same with showering. When you're showering, you're not thinking about showering, but a portion of your awareness, of your focus, is on that activity. And what that can do is it just draws enough of you that piece that would distract you has something to focus on. So let's see. I'm going to try to grab a couple more of these. Is reading a good mental break, or is that still too stimulating? Um, hmm. It's going to depend on what you're reading. Yeah, probably if it's playful kind of novels and things like that, you're probably okay. Honestly, if you're coming off of writing, I wouldn't necessarily jump into reading. I would maybe do something more active, using your hands, like even doing the dishes can be a really great transition. And it's also really helpful because, then the dishes are done. Um, let's see. Yeah, so I would say definitely not information unless it's pertaining to what you're trying to do, but give yourself at least 10 to 15 minutes of non, you know, cognitive work. So don't take in new information and things like that. I'm curious to the difference between flow and what they call hyperfocus for ADHD folks. Um, I haven't read about hyperfocus specifically, but what I do know is that it's actually really incredibly close. Um, I think the thing for people with ADHD, the hyperfocus can sometimes really go to an extreme. And so that can just be a problem, like we were saying, because but from what I understand, it's pretty close to the same neurochemicals and everything else. Like probably almost the same, just as an opinion, not as a statement of fact. But so the recovery process for people who are getting into hyperfocus is something to double down on. Really, if you're in hyperfocus for 3 hours, don't get into that state again if you can avoid it for the rest of the day, and just really try to recover. Um, some ways to get through the struggle phase. We talked a little bit about getting away from the computer, changing your environment, going for a walk, taking a shower, light activity, light exercise, listening to music that doesn't have words, so like classical or just electronic. Like music that doesn't have words allows our brain to, again, have something to focus on, but it's not going to drive you cognitively. When you're listening to lyrics, they're saying something, so you're getting a message that you have to process. When you're just listening to instruments, it's a different engagement of the brain. You don't have to process that information in the same way. How do you manage feelings of guilt, like you're procrastinating? Okay, yeah, this is a great one. And not doing enough work when you're taking those mental breaks. Getting into self-judgment is something that comes natural to most of us, especially as we're trying to accomplish something. This is, for me, I'll just get really quickly, I think I'm right at the time, but one thing I realized as I moved from a place of accomplishing a lot to a place of wanting to be more compassionate to myself was that my inner voice was actually a real asshole. There was this thing inside of me that was telling me, you have to do this. If you don't do this, you're this kind of person. You're da 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 da. Um, it was a very, what's the word I used to use? I can't remember right now. It doesn't matter. So judgment's going to come up. The thing that we can work on is cultivating compassion for ourselves, knowing we're going to put effort in, we're doing the best we can. And actually, these breaks are going to help us do more of what we want to do. Now, this could be a shift in how we operate right now. And quite honestly, it could result in less efficiency and less production at first. If you're used to being that person that just like drives through and gets things done and da 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 da, adding in breaks and things like that is probably going to feel a little bit uncomfortable at first, to be honest. So being aware of that ahead of time, you can notice that and just reaffirm for yourself that, we don't want to feel burnt out at the end of the day. We don't want to feel burnt out at the end of the week and the end of the month. And it's just, burnout is one of those things that's just going to erode your ability to be creative. It's a huge detriment. And so anything we can do to move ourselves away from that is going to be beneficial. So, yeah, let's see. I'll grab a couple more. Well, in the middle of the conference, I entered into a state of creative flow and didn't know what to do to keep focus on the meeting. Any suggestions? Um, Maybe can you tell, were you doing something that brought you into a state of flow? If you want to mute, you can just unmute, but if you're still here. And I'll jump to the next one. Do you think there's a value in listening to binaural beats through these cycles? There can be. There can definitely be a value to that. That is something I've utilized before. It depends. Play with it for yourself. I would say those kind of things can be beneficial, but not create a reliance on them. You were just relaxed. Deep listening then. If you found yourself relaxed with your eyes closed and it was easier to listen with your eyes closed. If looking at my face as I'm talking helps you, pay attention to that. Those kind of things can be helpful. Okay, guys and gals and everyone in between. Thank you so much. This was amazing. I hope this was helpful for everyone. If you have feedback or anything to say, or any other questions, you can message me here or on Discord. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the conference. Enjoy this little break between now and the next one. Go do something else. Get off the computer for a minute, go enjoy something, a quick bite or something like that. And if you can, don't grab your phone. All right, y'all. Have a good one.